Welcome everyone, this is Dr. Mercola, and today I am joined with Michele Simons, who has been practicing public health law since as long as I've been doing the site. And many of you may not be aware that public health law even exists as a specialty, but it does, and she's been a real white hat advocate for protecting us and really using strategies to fight corporate tactics that deceive and manipulate us. And she's written a really great report that we're going to get to in more detail. It's really great to connect with the good guys who are really seeking to strategize and help us stay healthy and really compete in a level playing field, because it's so difficult to do that otherwise. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So can you perhaps give us a little history as to how you became interested in this area and what compelled you and motivated? Because it's, from our perspective, it's always helpful to understand your motivation and your background to help us, understand how you came to your conclusions.
Well, I was actually graduating from law school and decided to change my own diet for personal reasons, and just discovered all these books out there that were talking about the benefits of eating a plant-based diet. And I hadn't learned about that, even though I'd been to public health school and certainly didn't learn about good nutrition or the impacts of our food choices in law school. So it was really eye-opening to me, and I realized that there weren't really many people at that time making the connection between what we eat and our government policies, and kind of really looking at the politics of food and then applying my legal background to, exposing the various ways that industry influences our government policies and so forth. So it was really realizing there was a need for lawyers to be working on these issues. And then in the late 90s, I got really inspired by discovering Marion Nestle's work, who of course wrote the book, The Politics of Food, but that wasn't, she hadn't written the book yet. So it was really still in the early days, and now of course the issue's exploded. So it's been really fun to watch everyone kind of catch up to where we've been for a while.
Well, terrific. And so you've been really active in this area for about 16, 17 years or so, 17 years, and your most recent adventure into exposing these corporate politics is the expose on the American Dietetic Association. So I'm wondering if you could expand on what the history of that and what involved and what you uncovered.
Sure. Well, I've been hearing for years about the annual meeting of the American Dietetic Association. Now they've changed their name to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. But people have been sending me photos and showing me that there was this problem going on at the annual meeting where there were all these big junk food companies exhibiting there. And so I decided 2 years ago it was time for me to kind of check it out for myself. And it was quite eye-opening. I mean, you walk into this expo show floor and you think you're in the wrong place. You think you can't possibly be in a nutrition conference. It actually looks like one big junk food expo. So after that first year of writing about it, just an article, and the influence of the various presenters there, I took a much deeper dive over the last 6 months or so to really uncover exactly how these relationships work between these major junk food companies and this very influential trade group.
And can you detail some of the specifics of how they are actually sponsored by many of these big food groups and that really control, the bulk of the food that is being offered to the Americans?
So the way it works is at the annual meeting, the various food companies like Coca-Cola, General Mills, Nestle, Kraft Foods, all of the major junk food purveyors buy sponsorships to be at these annual meetings and have the largest booths at the expo floor. In addition to just showcasing their junk food, they get to sponsor or give educational sessions at the meeting. So, for example, Nestle paid $50,000 for the benefit of doing a special session in which they talked about optimum hydration. It's probably no coincidence that Nestle also is the largest bottled water company in the world. So it's basically a pay-to-play operation where these companies pay big money. In exchange, they get to teach, essentially, these registered dietitians in exchange for continuing education units also. So the RDs are there in part to make sure they get their continuing education units, and they can do that by learning about optimum hydration from the nation's biggest bottled water company. That's just one example. I mean, there are many others, such as Coca-Cola, that sponsors ongoing webinars. So the relationship isn't just at the annual meeting, but throughout the year. So Coca-Cola is one of the most common sponsors of educational webinars. And for CEU units, again, registered dietitians can learn things from Coca-Cola like aspartame, A-OK, sugar in children's diets, not a problem, and so forth. So it really is an ongoing problem with these integral relationships between these food companies and this trade group.
Yes, and that anyone listening to this would be surprised and shocked to have this type of conflict of interest, and massive conflict of interest into these professionals. But I'm wondering if you could expand, because most people watching this may not recognize and realize the extent of influence that registered dietitians have. So how many registered dietitians are there in the country? How many attended this conference? And sort of address from that perspective, and then we'll go into some more of the specifics of the conflicts.
The reason I chose the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is because they are the nation's largest trade group for registered dietitians, and they represent 74,000 of the nation's health professionals whose job it is to help explain to Americans how to eat right. Now, this annual meeting, there's somewhere between 12 and 13,000 of these registered dietitians attending. And some have been in the profession for a while, some are students, young and impressionable. And so this is a huge meeting that happens every single year, where these companies get to show off their latest, slightly better for you junk food and teach these RDs.
So they really, most physicians, as most people watching this know, don't really receive much training in nutrition, and that's no surprise. So typically the physician is really busy in his practice and doesn't feel it's worth the time, effort, and energy to counsel his patients. We'll refer them to an RD, either they employ in their practice or through the hospital or whatever setting they are, and then assume that they're giving the correct, proper advice that's being taught because they're properly trained and licensed and attend these types of continued education processes. So it is really not only, yeah, it's a nice loop, and it's one that we typically don't think about as much with respect to these conflicts of interest, because typically we think about the drug companies, but the food companies is equally pervasive and perhaps even more pernicious in their influence on people's health, because it's ultimately the food choices that produce the disease. And if you have,
no, it's a good analogy, and I think a lot of sectors of society have started to recognize the problem of the pharmaceutical industry and its influence over the medical profession, so much so that even the medical profession itself has started to put some standards around, how they interact with the pharmaceutical industry. But we're so far from that when it comes to the influence of the food industry over health professionals in general, and in this case, registered dietitians.
Okay, now you mentioned two companies, Nestle's and Coca-Cola. Are they two of the biggest? And if they are, can you add some more so that we know who the players are in this game?
Well, there's lots of them. What I found was, if you look back over, say, the last 12 years, for which I was able to find the Academy's annual reports, it turns out that the National Cattlemen's Beef Association kind of wins the prize for having been a sponsor of this organization for all of the last 12 years. And then other companies that have are right up there are ConAgra, which is one of the biggest processed food companies, and General Mills, which is, of course, purveyor of all of the awful candy cereals aimed at children. Other companies that are heavily involved are PepsiCo, the nation's largest food company, by the way, not just a soda company, but also owns Frito-Lay, largest snack food company, and Gatorade and other, junk food brands. These are massive companies that own, it's hard to walk down any aisle in the supermarket without running into some product made by one of these companies, right? Nestle, Kraft, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo. They're the nation's largest junk food companies. And then on the fast food side, you also have, at the annual meeting, for example, was McDonald's. No surprise. They want to make sure that their being viewed as a good-for-you fast food company. And so at their booth, they would be sampling salads and smoothies and oatmeal, giving away free oatmeal for the RDs first thing in the morning, making you think that those are the only items that this company sells.
Yes, indeed. And you had mentioned earlier that some of these companies will spend up to $50,000 to sponsor an event, and that may sound like a lot to many people watching that, but in relationship to what their annual revenues are, I think it's a drop in a bucket. So maybe you can address or comment on what type of revenues these companies are generating and how they can yield so much interest.
Right. Well, these are multi-billion-dollar companies, and remember these are international companies. So a company like Nestle, I mean, I don't even know what their annual revenues are, but they're in the tens of billions of dollars. Same thing with PepsiCo, $60 billion in revenue for PepsiCo alone. So these are companies that are, have plenty of money to play with when it comes to just sprinkling a few $1,000s here and there at these types of groups. It's a big return on investment for them, right? Because they just have to put up 10 or 20 or 50 even $1,000, and in return they get the audience of this front of the line nutrition professionals. So they're basically, trying to use these professionals to carry their message to their clients, right? That's the name of the game here, to make sure the next time an RD talks to a client, they say, gee, you should really try this better for you baked Lay's potato chip because it has a few, less grams of salt or grams of fat. Right? It's to make sure that RDs are recommending these still highly processed, nutrient-deficient junk foods to their clients.
Yes, indeed. In fact, the type of information they're dispensing, I think, is probably best characterized by a story that I can remember about 10 years ago now, where I believe it was the president of this organization was quoted as saying that sugar has nothing to do with diabetes. do you remember that one?
I think that's actually in my book, and it was from the American Diabetes Association.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I got the diabetes and dietetics.
They're both ADA.
Yeah, that's right.
American Dietetic, but no, that was the Diabetes Association, which claimed there was no connection between sugar and diabetes, which was a rather hilarious exchange with a reporter from the scientific officer, actually, of the American Diabetes Association. Now, of course, we have some evidence to the contrary, so I don't know what he would have to say about that now. But that was another example of industry influence. In that case, it was the company Cadbury Schweppes that was giving a lot of money to the American Diabetes Association, and this was the response from them that, oh, well, what's the problem?
Yeah, and that is pretty obvious. I mean, anyone with a small amount of common sense can figure that one out. But what becomes more complex is when you introduce these chemical derivatives, like artificial sweeteners. And I don't know if there was much of that at the event that you attended, but it would seem that there's a probability that it was, because they're even more pernicious than the sugar.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has basically taken a position of they don't see a problem with artificial sweeteners. That's their official position. And, that is the opinion of some other health professionals, too. It's not just them. But the point is that this possibly could be influenced or at least connected to the fact, again, that Coca-Cola is offering these webinars, right, where they're giving RDs continuing education units. And one webinar, the entire subject matter was artificial sweetener. So it was sort of, the usual rhetoric industry uses as myth busting or the truth behind artificial sweeteners to try to get underneath the type of information that you're putting out there about the problems with artificial sweeteners. So an entire webinar brought to you by Coca-Cola saying things like, oh, there's no problem and there's no science to support the idea that aspartame or other artificial sweeteners are bad for you. And so, of course, these are the messages that RDs are getting, in which case they can then continue to recommend Diet Pepsi and Diet Coke as good alternatives to the full calorie sugary beverages. And, obviously this is a problem.
It is. And I'm wondering, why there aren't more independent, objective, free-thinking RDs who can look critically at the research. I mean, they are trained professionals. I mean, why do they have to rely on these messages, or is it the same response that we could really apply to physicians?
I don't like to paint too broad a brush, right, with the entire sort of registered dietitian profession. In fact, I was really clear in my report that I'm not attacking the profession of RDs generally. Of course, there are many, independent-minded, scientifically trained RDs who are able to ferret out the good information about that even exists about these types of products. And there are many RDs, in fact, that have rejected membership in the academy, mostly because of these relationships. And the problem really lies with the leadership of this organization and the fact that they're putting the stamp of approval on these types of webinars and companies that obviously are contributing to the very problem that the profession is trying to address. So, I think it's important to separate the individuals, just like there are good MDs out there that are doing the right thing and reject the sort of, company line, so to speak. There are many good RDs and other nutrition professionals that are doing the right thing.
Well, that's a very important distinction. Thank you for pointing that out. And hopefully we can inspire the RDs to understand this at a deeper level, and the power is in the membership and their numbers, and they clearly outnumber the leadership, and they have the power, potential power, to change that in those positions and to really stop those types of sponsorships. So can you provide some additional examples of some of the outrageous behavior that you saw there and really have written about in your book? Or
Yeah.
your report? It's a report, it's not a book.
What was really troubling was just, even besides the expo floor, was attending several of the educational sessions, as they're called. So, for example, one I attended wasn't sponsored by McDonald's, and that's partly what made it troubling. So, if you look in the program, it will say, "Oh, here's a session on fast food." And so I attended it, and it was basically a big PR infomercial for McDonald's with Cindy Goody, the head of nutrition. There is someone who actually is the director of nutrition at McDonald's, and she gave the big song and dance about how wonderful McDonald's is doing. And I sat next to an RD who afterwards was disappointed because she herself thought it was one big infomercial and came to actually hear substantive information. And I later had an interesting conversation with another RD who told me that McDonald's was not in the program and had not sponsored any kind of educational session, even though I was telling her that I had sat in the session where McDonald's was indeed educating the RDs and the audience. And that was because there was no disclosure in the program that McDonald's was even going to be speaking there. You had to kind of dig through and see who the speakers were. But this was just an example of some of the ways that a company like McDonald's can even get on the program without sponsoring a session. And as how in the world they were able to do that without even apparently paying for the privilege is pretty troubling right there. And then other sessions were, for example, the National Dairy Council, also, by the way, huge sponsor of the Academy, had one sponsored session, so it was clear in the program that they were sponsoring the session, and they would talk about how even people who are lactose intolerant or allergic to milk, it was perfectly fine, for the majority of the world's ethnic groups who are lactose intolerant or others who happen to be allergic, perfectly fine to eat dairy, and because of course it's so important for calcium, because the dairy industry has done such a good job of brainwashing us into thinking milk equals calcium. And several registered dietitians in that session were so upset about these messages that they actually got up and walked out. And I tried to ask them later, well, gee, shouldn't you get your money back from your own trade group, because they came to hear scientific information about what to do with people who have allergies and so forth, and yet they were given this company line from the dairy industry that they should just keep eating dairy.
Yeah, that's really sad. So when was your report released?
In January.
In January of 2013. So since your report has been released, I'm wondering if you can comment on the feedback you've received from members of the the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and what their comments were.
Sure. Well, they weren't too happy about it, to say the least. They engaged in what I would call typical industry tactics, such as shooting the messenger. So they made me the problem as opposed to, my criticism of them. So they said that I was biased and I had an agenda And then they accused me of inaccuracies. This went on for several weeks where they claimed there were inaccuracies in the report without naming them until I finally said, well, tell me what they are, because I'd certainly like to correct them. And then they finally came out with this, supposedly damning list of inaccuracies, and there really weren't any. They just were arguing with me over, opinion-related matters. So it was really disappointing, not surprising. The membership, I will say, the RDs that get it, were embarrassed and really outraged by this response. For example, one of the points of research that I brought out in the report talked about how the registered dietitians themselves are not happy with these sponsorships, and some 80% of RDs have said they don't like some of the top sponsors of the Academy. And yet, one of the responses the Academy came out with was to say, oh, our RDs support our sponsorship program. And meanwhile, the RDs are over here saying, no, 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 we really don't. So the good news is, like I said before, there are a number of registered dietitians who are speaking out. And in the wake of my report, I'm happy to say a group has formed more formally, and they call themselves Dietitians for Professional Integrity. And they've so far formed a Facebook page, and I know we're kind of working behind the scenes to plan some activities to really tell the leadership that this is not okay. And I'm really encouraged by that because, as you say, it really is, the membership does outnumber the leadership, and that will change over time. The leadership will have to get that message, otherwise the membership's going to go away.
Well, I applaud those efforts, and we certainly can hopefully support those efforts and encourage anyone who's watching this who knows an RD or encounters one in their healthcare setting to have them view this and to perhaps get a copy of your report. And what's the best way to access your report?
It's right on the homepage of my website, which is eatdrinkpolitics.com.
Okay, eatdrinkpolitics.com, no space. Excellent. And can you, I'm wondering if you could also comment on some other recommendations. Clearly, I think sending the message to the leadership is going to be one of the most important ones, and encouraging them to have this transparency that clearly wasn't there when the McDonald's example you provided. But do you have any other recommendations to encourage changing them to a more important and useful organization? It's going to provide strategies and therapies that will, in fact, move people towards health, because they are working with a tool that has probably the most power of any at the physician's disposal.
Right. Well, yes, I had several recommendations, including transparency, as you said, listening to their RDs who are, clearly trying to tell them a different message than they want to hear. Also, another aspect we didn't talk about was their policy position. So what I found was that this group is really not willing to take some of the more controversial positions that might upset their sponsors. So, I really strongly recommended that this group reconsider that and get engaged in these very important policy matters, such as marketing to children, such as GMO labeling, issues that the Academy is just sort of taking this, turning a blind eye to, and probably because they don't want to upset their sponsors. So that's another really important aspect. But overall, to really do the due diligence to really listen to its members and be more responsive to the members who are speaking out.
So there is another organization, that's Center for Science and the Public Interest, or CSPI, who ostensibly has similar goals as you as a public health attorney. And they wrote recently in the New York Times that they disagreed with your report and that felt that there was significant leadership changes already in place at the association. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, I actually did point out in my report that there are positive leadership changes. So, for example, in Washington, D.C., there are several staff members there who are doing their level best to advocate in a positive way. And I think that's what CSPI was referring to, that they are, have a good relationship with the lobbyists for the Academy in DC, and that I'm totally on board with. That's great. There still is this other problem, though, which is that the headquarters of the organization remains in this, sort of old, outdated mode of collaborating with industry. And I happen to know that there have been some internal disagreements where the lobbyists that, again, trying to do the good guy lobbyists in DC for the Academy are trying to do the right thing. But then if, HQ says, oh, no, 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 we can't take that position, then their hands are tied. So I think there's, a mix of developments going on here. While the leadership has made some positive steps, but there's still this tension where the old guard is kind of still holding on and wanting to, in some cases, still do the bidding of the food industry that sponsors them.
It seems as if sponsorship is a crucial component, and I'm wondering if you have any suggestions to them as to how to change that, because obviously to run the organization is going to require a certain amount of funding and to pay for the event, and I mean, it's not all paid for by membership dues. So what alternative sources of revenue would they seek to replace the ones that they're getting from industry?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I actually took a specific look at their financial statements, at least the data that they release publicly in their annual reports. And, the way it breaks down is they certainly make most of their money from membership dues. Over the last couple of years, at least the way they report it, it appears only about 9 or 10% of their income is from these corporate sponsorships. In the most recent year, available as little as 5%. Now, again, they may be kind of reporting that money in a strange way that doesn't really illuminate the full percentage of money that comes from corporations, but it appears that they could easily make up that revenue from maybe an increase in membership or some other sources. So, that really does raise the question, well, what is going on here? Is there something deeper to these relationships? Is it just this philosophy? And anyway, if your organization can only survive by taking money from the likes of Coke and Pepsi and McDonald's, then I think, maybe it's time to really rethink your mission and whether you should be in existence at all.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that is actually very surprising information to me. I would have thought it was the exact reverse. To find only 5 to 10% of the reported funding is from these sponsorships would make it clearly very simple strategy of solution. I mean, all you have to do is increase membership fees relatively moderately to account for the difference, a 10% increase. So they don't really have a good answer to that one.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's a little hard to really get to the bottom of, and that's part of what I was recommending through more transparency, that we need to really understand. Because, for example, they have these ongoing partnerships. That's what they call them. So several companies get the name sponsor for this annual relationship with Ann. So Hershey's, for example, is a partner, but we don't know how much money exactly that Hershey's is paying. In other words, what does that contract look like? How much is Hershey's paying for this partnership level status? I mean, that's where it gets hard to really kind of tease out. So, when the Academy is reporting these figures, it's not clear what bucket they're putting it in.
Well, here's another interesting question for you, because especially as an attorney, one of the most important legal documents is the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. The first bill, of course, is the freedom of speech. So how do you balance that freedom of speech with the industry's ability to advertise and manipulate and deceive the public?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I like to say is that the food industry likes to wrap itself in the U.S. Constitution, right? They like to claim that they have a no-holds-barred First Amendment free speech right to advertise whatever they want, anytime, anywhere, to anyone. And actually, the law doesn't really work that way. While it is true that advertising in general has been given certain free speech protection by our Supreme Court, it's not a blank check to advertise anytime, anywhere, anything. So one of the most important limitations is that misleading or deceptive advertising is not protected free speech. In other words, it's not okay for a company to, say, target a 3-year-old, as McDonald's does with its Happy Meals, okay? Because a 3-year-old cannot understand what advertising is, doesn't have the cognitive capacity to even know what advertising is or what persuasive intent is, which is the linchpin of advertising, okay? As adults, we're not so good at it either, but at least, an argument can be made that we have a better cognitive capacity to withstand advertising messages. With small children, there's no question that they do not. That is not protected free speech. So many lawyers have, held this opinion for many years, that in fact, the government can regulate, even ban marketing to young children of any kind, by the way, not just food, and not necessarily. It's not that carrots or spinach is okay either. I mean, that's another tension going on. Some advocates are saying, well, we just want companies to market healthy food to children. And my response to that is, well, if a 3-year-old can't understand, what a Happy Meal is, why would they understand that they're being advertised to with a carrot? So marketing to children is just across the board deceptive and is not protected free speech. And we absolutely can be doing something about that. Unfortunately, big surprise, there's no political will to do so, certainly not in Washington, D.C.
All right, so if suits are brought up to address this, they're just rejected or not even heard or just summarily dismissed out of court?
We haven't really had much in the way of lawsuits. So you're talking about, say, a private lawyer bringing a lawsuit against a company for deceptively marketing. We've had one attempt actually by Center for Science to the Public Interest. They did sue McDonald's for marketing Happy Meals. It gets tricky because there's this concept in law called standing. So the mother is actually the one purchasing, or the parent is purchasing the Happy Meal. The deception is to the child. So this particular case got thrown out of court. It was filed in California, and the court said, well, the mother really doesn't have standing because the deception is to the child. So, we still have to work out these kinks. I think that we may be able to find a jurisdiction, perhaps where that isn't a barrier. Unfortunately, we don't have enough lawyers, frankly, even willing to push this envelope, but I'm hopeful that we will someday.
It's another good question. How many public health attorneys like yourself are there?
Well, when I started out way back in the mid-90s, there weren't many. And in fact, I didn't even think of myself as a public health lawyer. I thought, I was a lawyer who happened to have a public health degree. And then over time, this field of public health law has really grown. So that's the good news. There are many more of us now than when I started. There are whole centers for public health law, groups that really work to shape law in a way to help people make healthier choices, et cetera. I would say, it's a growing field. However, for me, the missing piece is sort of the political part, right? So, we have smart lawyers who can draft all the laws they want, but we really have to, of course, create the political movement to support those efforts and also kind of play defense. So one of the, good news, bad news things that's happening is as we're getting local laws passed, state laws passed, industry can get preemption laws passed. So preemption is where, let's say, a state government passes a law to wipe out local laws. So, for example, the city of Cleveland got a law passed to ban trans fat in restaurants. Well, the restaurant industry went to its friends in the Capitol in Ohio and said, we want to wipe out that local law. And now there's actually legal battle over that. So it's important, as lawyers, that we realize that there's always the politics involved, and we have to stay on top of these types of sort of trump card efforts by the food industry.
Yeah, we see another one just happened this week with Monsanto just sliding in on their carpet. No, it was written anonymously as a rider to a bill that gets passed that immunizes them from any federal prosecution. I mean, that is just beyond insane how this type of legislation gets passed. But it's understandable considering the power that they have and influence with their lobbying efforts.
Right. No, it's a good example of advocates using the courtroom successfully in this case, to stop Monsanto and other biotech companies from planting GMO crops that are found to be essentially illegally approved by the USDA. So because we've had some success with using the court in that way, Monsanto did this end run, went to its friends in Congress to essentially say USDA has to ignore any court decision that says that the approval has been done illegally. Now, I wouldn't call it complete immunity. I would say it's an end run for now. The good news is this will definitely be fought in court, and at least the provision that was just passed is only good for 6 months, the length of the budget bill that it got attached to. So there's still more fighting to come on this issue.
Well, that's good. So it's not as bad as it would appear ostensibly.
And of course, it's not just the public health lawyers that need to kind of wake up and realize
Sure.
they have a political battle on our hands.
The public
It's
as a
really
whole.
The entire sort of public health world and food activists. I mean, frankly, even the food movement doesn't always realize they're in a political battle. They're sort of distracted with some of these sort of happier projects of, farmers markets and so forth, which are important. And yet, as long as the sort of processed food, conventional food paradigm remains in place. It's still, they're just going to be minor victories. So, I think our work is cut out for us to get everyone involved in these issues to understand that we are up against a massive, massive industry, several industries, if you think about biotech, pesticide, pharmaceutical, the junk food industry, et cetera. And yet, I think there is strength in numbers. And even though we don't have this resources of these industries, we absolutely have the numbers on our side. And it is a matter of, coming together and working together in more coordinated ways to be stronger against these powerful interests.
I couldn't agree more. So I want to get back to the First Amendment issue, which you expanded on and used as an example the unfairness of advertising to children because they don't really have the discernment capabilities to differentiate the truth from the nonsense.
Unfortunately, over the years, schools have sort of opened their doors wide to junk food purveyors of every kind. So all the same companies we've been talking about, in one way or another, have found their way into schools. And this is an ongoing controversy and challenge where, schools are just, walk through the halls of any random high school these days, and they're just chock full of vending machines full of Coke and Pepsi, Gatorade, etc. And there have been many efforts by some of the nation's largest school districts like New York, LA, Chicago, Boston to try and change that situation. And in many cases, they're, sort of replacing the products with allegedly healthier versions that you and I would probably not agree are so much healthier. But that's kind of where we're at with the issue. There are some examples of school districts and states that have gotten rid of vending or what are called competitive foods, foods that actually compete with the school meal program. School meals, of course, are a whole other challenge, but competitive foods are particularly a problem, and in some cases they have been gotten rid of, mostly in elementary schools. This is important right now because the USDA, which has jurisdiction over school food, is getting ready to promulgate new nutrition standards for these so-called competitive foods. So again, these are vending machine foods and what's called a la carte items. These are foods that are sold outside the school meal program, but are things like fast food items that compete with the reimbursable school meal. So this is, an issue that's heating up right now. We know the food industry is gearing up to make sure those new federal standards are going to be as weak as possible. And in contrast, some groups are saying, well, we want better nutrition standards. I'm actually taking a whole different approach to this in that my comments to USDA say that we should get rid of competitive foods altogether, because I don't really think replacing Coke with Diet Coke is such a great idea. And there are many reasons that we should not allow these types of foods in schools at all.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, you've done a great effort here in helping exposing some of the corruption, the deceit, and the lack of transparency in this organization. With your report, you've got many, many years in front of you, my guess. And I'm wondering, what's the next project down the line, and what do you hope that you might be able to facilitate or catalyze?
Sure. Well, I do have a couple of reports in the works. In fact, one probably on the dairy industry, and I think there's a lot of work to be done exposing the real brainwashing that industry has done on the American psyche, and I'm hoping to work with groups in a stronger way on really countering corporate tactics. So I have a whole new talk I'm doing now that looks at how the food industry lies, how it engages PR professionals, really unpacking the types of messaging that industry engages in these policy battles. And I feel like there's really a role for assisting people who, advocates and policymakers, whoever is going up against industry. What I envision for my long-term plan is really, workshops and trainings and train the trainers, and really thinking about countering corporate tactics as a legitimate field of study, even for academics to look at, and also as a specific skill. We need to build the skills in advocacy, first of all, even just learning how to lobby, just at that basic level. But then, in addition, really building the skills of advocates and countering corporate tactics, exposing the front groups, exposing the PR exposing everything that industry is doing so that you can be better equipped when you start down the road. I mean, too many advocates are just jumping in, right? They want to see a soda tax. That's the latest sort of, bandwagon that a lot of my colleagues are jumping on. And I want to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute. Is that even the best policy to go forward with? I'm not even convinced. First of all, we need to be really strategic when we're thinking about proposing policies. And then, of course, what are we up against when we want to propose something like a soda tax or a restriction on marketing to children? Really plotting out what to expect and then figuring out a strategic plan and, of course, gathering the proper resources to be able to counter this massive, massive industry. So that's what I see really developing much more.
Well, what do you perceive to be the factor that's going to enlighten their consciousness to this type of strategic intervention once you expose to them? Because it seems like there's a whole shift in consciousness that needs to occur to get the bigger strategic picture.
Right. Well, right. There's sort of, I guess, I think of different audiences that need help along the way. So there's people who, like you said, don't even understand that this is a political fight that we're in, or that the food industry is at the heart of the problem. And clearly those people need just the kind of the basic education and information, and there's a lot of that out there. But then for people who have kind of gotten to that point where, okay, they understand that the food industry is the problem and we need to really counter their marketing and lobbying, that's to me where the critical intervention is needed. To say it's not enough to just recognize that we have a problem on our hands. It's not enough even to just expose the problem. It's certainly not enough to be doing research reports on yet, more marketing to children problems. Like, I'm so tired of reports about this problem. We know this is the problem. Let's really get much smarter and more strategic about how to counter the industry and how to beat them at their own game. And that's where I feel like, there's just a tremendous opportunity.
I couldn't agree more. I'm excited. I'm excited that we connected and can help share your message and working together in the future in this project, because this change is certainly and desperately needed, because so many people's lives and the quality of lives are at stake, and it's really being sacrificed at the expense of corporate profits.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
All right. Well, so I guess the best way, if people want more information about this report, go to your website again, which is?
Yes, eatdrinkpolitics.com.
Eatdrinkpolitics.com. Okay.